Welcome to the party. You found the Mouse Castle Lounge, the place to be for good times and great conversations from the world of Disney. The bar is open, your table is waiting, and drinks are now being served. Come on in. And now, here's your host, the keeper of the Mouse Castle Lounge, Tim Calloway.
Welcome to the lounge. It's December 11th, 2015, and I'm Tim Calloway. What a fun show we've got for you today. Disney historian Jim Korkis is my guest. Plus, we're going to take a look inside Walt Disney's newly restored office at the Walt Disney Studios. But first, keep in touch with the Mouse Castle by visiting us on Facebook at facebook.com/The Mouse Castle. On Twitter, I am Disney Tim, and of course, the Mouse Castle is also on Tumblr, Pinterest, and Instagram. You can share your questions and comments by emailing us at podcast@themousecastle.com or call our listener line at 702-475-5MCL. That's 702-475-5625. And of course, you can always visit the blog at themousecastle.com, where you can download the free Mouse Castle Lounge app for your mobile device. Just click the pic that says, "Get the app." This week, the Walt Disney Studios in Burbank unveiled and rededicated the restored office suite of Walt Disney. It was a painstaking labor of love by Disney Studio employees and archivists to recreate Walt's office exactly as it appeared at the time of his death. It was authentic down to the actual furniture and personal items that were there in 1966. On hand for the dedication were Walt Disney Company Chairman and CEO Bob Iger, Walt's grandchildren, and Disney legends Richard Sherman, Catherine Beaumont, Marty Sklar, and Dave Smith. We'll be hearing from some of them a little later. Before that, though, it's my pleasure to welcome back to the lounge Disney historian Jim Korkis. Jim is a meticulous researcher and a marvelous storyteller, and his two most recent books, Secret Stories of Walt Disney World and The Vault of Walt Volume 4, belong in your collection, as do Jim's many other books. Please welcome Jim Korkis, my guest today in the Mouse Castle Lounge. I find this hard to believe that it has been almost 2 years since I had this gentleman on my show. Jim Korkis, welcome back to the lounge.
Thank you very much, Tim. I wondered what had happened to you. I thought that maybe the minions at Universal Studios had captured you and were holding you for ransom, and nobody knew.
They could very well have. I don't know, but yeah, I just so what have you been up to? Yeah, a long time no talk to.
Well, life has gone on for the last 2 years for me, and of course, one of the things that I'm the happiest about is that I've been able to write more books, and people have been very excited about getting those books. In fact, for the holiday season here, I have two brand new books that are out. Vault of Walt, the fourth volume. And
wow.
A book that's devoted solely to Walt Disney World theme parks, called Secret Stories of Walt Disney World, because as you know, when you call somebody a Disney fan, that's a pretty wide definition. You know, somebody can consider themselves a Disney fan, but they only collect pins or vinylmation, or some people consider themselves a Disney fan, but they're only interested in the Disney animation, or they're interested in the Disney theme parks, but some of them are only interested in Disneyland.
True. And your Walt Disney World book kind of addresses that, because at least from a theme park standpoint, there's been a lot written about Disneyland, but not near as much about Walt Disney World.
No, it's always surprised me, and of course I had the wonderful opportunity to work at Walt Disney World in a number of different roles, in a number of different capacities, but it was always considered sort of the orphan, even though you had 4 theme parks, and you had a downtown shopping area, and 2 water parks, and over 24 resort hotels, and yet everybody's like, no, I'm going to go to Disneyland. But there's so much more out here.
Oh, yeah.
And what's scary to me as well is there's been so much documentation about Disneyland, especially with it celebrating the 60th anniversary now. And there's a whole flood of new Disneyland-related books that are out there. But for Walt Disney World, there really wasn't anything. There was... Since the World Began by Jeff Curdy, and Jeff is a good friend of mine, and he told me that he was under the gun to write that book, and so some of the sections on the opening of Disney MGM Studios and Pleasure Island and all that, a lot of that he had to write just off of press releases because it hadn't been created. And yet that's the book that most people use as the reference now, because the other Walt Disney World books seem to be more trivia oriented, which is fine. I love trivia as much as anyone else, but in terms of telling the story and what is the information, that was getting lost. And I noticed that even in the trivia books, there was an awful lot of cut and paste going on. You know, that, oh, well, this appeared on the internet, so this must be true. Or this is something that everybody knows. So, you know, there had been no research, and a lot of names of people who had been involved with projects or how a project actually developed had been lost. And so I thought, you know, by golly, I wish somebody would write that book. And nobody did.
And guess who that is? Yeah.
So I said, I better get down and write this, you know, while my mind is still active and has retained this information of, you know, talking with some of the Imagineers, talking with some of the executives who ran the park in the beginning as well, and get this stuff down so that people can reference it. Because a lot of times, you know, everybody just assumes, well, Disney has all this documentation. And having worked for Disney, I will tell you that is not the case. Because sometimes there's no time or there's no money to have somebody document it. And sometimes things are changing right up until the last minute. Then as soon as the thing opens or whatever, you're on to the next project. Right. So why go back and look at some of these things?
Yeah, and also too, you know, so much of what Disney would have in its possession is the official version, is the press releases, is the days and dates and, you know, specifics about it, the company version of it. And what often gets lost are the behind the scenes stories and the anecdotes and the really human elements that you don't typically get in a history. And
well, it like the whole story of the lantern there in Japan. You know, it was a gift given to Roy O. Disney by Emperor Hirohito,
the stone lantern,
who was a huge Disney fan. In fact, he was buried with the Mickey Mouse watch that he was given by the Disney company.
Nice.
Because he loved it so much. And so for the opening of Walt Disney World, he gave a lantern to light the way to happiness and good fortune, and he gave that to Roy O. Disney. And so that was at the Polynesian for years until Epcot opened in 1982, and they felt that, yes, that should, you know, be over in the Japan Pavilion, but then they never put up a plaque, you know, explaining what this was about. And I talked to Imagineers about it, and they said, well, no, we're not putting up a plaque because the Japan Pavilion is the story of Japan. And if we put up a plaque about this lantern, it's not the story of Japan, it's the story of Disney. And so for decades, people have gone by that and have no idea, you know, oh, that's just an element of detail that, you know, the Disney Imagineers have put there. No, there's a whole story behind it. There's a whole reason why that's there. Just like the German miniature train garden and how that it was created and evolved. And I'm looking, you know, on the internet, I'm looking in books, I'm not seeing any of that, and I go, I know this story. I better put this down in the book. And
it needs to be told.
Yeah, and as you see in Secret Stories of Walt Disney World, there's well over 80, 90 stories in there, and I kept them short. You know, Tim, as well as anybody else does, that I'm in love with the sound of my own voice, and I can just go on forever. But in the book, I kept them short, so they're only each story is only 2 pages. So I tried to cram in as much information, as many facts, as many anecdotes, as many quotes from people who are involved with that. But somebody who picks this up, I think, can then pass themselves off to their friends and family as an expert of Walt Disney World.
And you even talk about that at the beginning of your book, the fact that there are so many stories that are disseminated by cast members at Walt Disney World that they accept as fact that are nowhere near true. And it's not that they're setting out to misinform. I mean, they're relaying these stories in full of good intent, but somewhere along the way, they're just getting them wrong. Now your book is subtitled "Things You Never Knew You Never Knew."
Mm-hmm.
What was something that you discovered in your research that surprised you, or you didn't expect to find out about?
I was constantly surprised on many things. That the dragon calliope that's over there at the ranch at Fort Wilderness, you can go and you can, look at it and you can push the button and you can hear it play. And it never even occurred to me that, my gosh, this was something that Walt Disney purchased himself in 1955 for Disneyland, for the Mickey Mouse Club Circus, and had that done, and that it was an authentic circus wagon. I suspected that, but that it had been used in so many Disneyland parades, and then it moved over and it was for the 25th parade at Walt Disney World, and then just stayed, at Walt Disney World. So, a lot of these things you just accept. And again, I was a cast member, so I was told a lot of things that were just wrong because they had either just heard it, from somebody else and just assumed, well, that must be it. Because cast members don't have any centralized location where they can check on material. I thought, oh my gosh, the Disney University, or they have one of those red phones that connects directly to the Disney archives, so you can pull that up, because I get asked questions all the time. Today I was just asked, right before this podcast, I was not by Tim, by the way. I was asked, was Walt Disney left-handed? Because I was told by cast members that's the reason that they stamp the left hand when you leave the park. And I said, no, Walt was not left-handed, and if he was left-handed, you would have seen it, on the introductions to the TV show, or you would have heard somebody talk about that. That was not the case. They stamped the left hand simply because that's the hand. Most people are right-handed, and left hand is the one that people generally don't use, and so that prevents smudging and all sorts of other things. And you're not as self-conscious about your left hand, whereas if it was on your right hand, you'd go, oh, am I disturbing the mark somehow here, or whatever. I got somebody who asked me if Walt Disney wore dentures because his teeth always look so white, and I said, are you just looking at the black and white photo? Because the teeth will be white. So you get those, but as a Walt Disney World cast member, there was no place to phone to check on any of these things. And if you went to Imagineering, ever since Michael Eisner took over in 84, 85, every department had to be revenue generating. And so that even included maintenance and janitors. And so how do you generate revenue? If you're a janitor, you eliminate staff. You eliminate material that you have in storage. Imagineering got shredded up a lot of material that they had in storage so that they wouldn't have to pay the storage costs and the insurance and all that. And so working as a cast member, if you contact Imagineering, they have to charge you for finding that information.
Oh my gosh. And
Imagineering charges a minimum. If you're in good and they're doing a favor for you, it's $100 an hour or any portion thereof.
Wow. I never knew that.
Yes.
Things I never knew I never knew. Yeah.
Yes. So again, there was no centralized location to find this material. And then when I was working at Epcot, especially in guest relations, I became, because I should have been charging $100 an hour or portion of thereof, but people would always phone Epcot and they would say, is Jim working today? We have this question and all of that. I think one of the strangest questions I ever got is I got called down to the desk they had a guest who was there who had a question that they couldn't answer. And usually people have similar questions. So, it's usually easy to answer questions, but every now and then you get a curveball. And this was the kindest old woman that you could ever imagine, And she said, "What does Walt Disney World weigh?" So, when you're given one of those questions,
What?
you should follow up with some follow-up questions. And I said, I've never been asked that question before. I'm very curious why you are interested in that.
Is it looking a little peaked? Is it maybe not feeling well?
and basically she was under the belief that there were tunnels running under all of Walt Disney World. So how much does Walt Disney World weigh that they're supporting all of that? So once I knew what she was really saying, I was able to say, no, there are no tunnels. There are utilidors, at the Magic Kingdom, because again, there's an aquifer in Florida, so you can't dig down, and have basements and all that. So they built all of these concrete structures and alleyways, and then they built the Magic Kingdom on top of that. So the Magic Kingdom is actually on the second floor.
Yeah.
And I said, but they soon discovered that limited things, that certainly helped. You had all the utilities, there and all that, so guests didn't see, the electrical wires or the AVAC system that takes care of trash and all that. And certainly cast members could get from, one section to another section of the park very quickly, and you wouldn't have a person dressed up like the Old West, walking across Tomorrowland. You just drop down into the utilidors. But what they found was that limited what you could have in the utilidors, because you could only have a vehicle go into the utilidors that was smaller than the width or the height of the utilidor. And
Right.
So at the Magic Kingdom, the only vehicle that goes in there, other than a couple of those electric golf cart Pargos, is the Brinks armored truck. No other vehicles go through there. And so when they built Epcot, they realized, we really need to have more options. So they built a perimeter road behind all of the structures. And so that's why some things, the fish and chip shop that they added over in the UK pavilion suddenly appeared overnight. You were there one day and there was nothing there, and then the next day you come and suddenly there's this structure in place because it was backstage in these huge giant cranes,
Boom, there
plopped
it is.
it right down, and then you went through the process of hooking up, the utilities and all of those things. To me, this is just fascinating. I've had people come up to me and say, well, Jim, you're destroying the magic. And I said, well, I'm not putting a gun to anybody's head to read any of this information. I said, but I think that for some people, this actually enhances the magic.
I'm raising my hand over here. Yes.
I think there's people who like to know these things. And I certainly, before I was a Disney cast member, I was just, enamored of all of this. Somebody would give me a copy of Eyes and Ears, and it was like, oh my gosh, this is a treasure, because this is only given to cast members, and so this has information that only cast members would have had. And I was so curious. Well, how do they do this, and how do they do that? And then once I became a Disney cast member, I saw that Disney sometimes the right hand didn't know what the right hand was doing.
Mm-hmm.
And that sometimes Disney was successful in spite of itself, not because of itself. And that was exciting too, to see how some of that happened. I thought, gee, I bet there are people who are probably interested in Walt Disney World, and there's an awful lot of misinformation. And again, as I said, a lot of cut and pasting. So this misinformation constantly gets repeated. And there are people who believe that, well, if it appears in print, if it's on the internet, it must be true. If it wasn't, they wouldn't allow that to happen.
Yes. As an example, you have a story in your book about the Empress Lily, which was one of my favorite places. I lived in Central Florida in the late 70s and went to school. And, the Empress Lily, when it was the, Empress Lily with, with the multiple restaurants and the lounge and what have you. I mean, it was a wonderful place. It's Fulton's Crab House now. And I think it's lost some of the charm and the elegance of the Empress Lily.
I think it's lost a lot of the charm.
Yeah, I was being polite. But I'll never forget riding a shuttle bus then it was called the Lake Buena Vista Shopping Village. And the driver was talking about the Empress Lily, which had only been open for a short time at that point. And he said, "Oh yeah, originally they intended it to be a boat or sternwheeler that would navigate the lake and dock at various points and all that. But they found out that it was just too heavy and too big of an enterprise. So that's why it's docked there permanently." And the truth of the matter is, it's a building in the shape of a paddle wheel.
Just like Gertie the dinosaur is a building, Yes.
Yeah. So I was very happy to see you had a little bit in there about the Empress Lily. But when you're referring to cast members telling stories, here was a perfect example.
And again, they're not doing this maliciously. A lot of times they've never been told the story. And nature abhors a vacuum, so you make up things. Or sometimes they heard something, but they misremembered what they heard,
Like playing telephone.
Yeah, exactly like that. And those are the toughest things where part of that is true, but the rest of it is not. And then, again, as a former cast member, I will tell you that you want to make people happy. You want to answer their questions. You don't want to leave them hanging there. You want to give them something, and Imagineers actually have a phrase for this. I'll bet you're not familiar with this phrase, and maybe some of your listeners aren't either, but the Imagineers use it. It's called logical erroneous conclusion. Logical erroneous conclusion. So, yeah, that sort of makes sense,
It must be true.
Sort of, well, and since I don't know anything that contradicts that, I'll go with that. But no, that's not what that's there for, and I think the perfect example of that is, of course, the Haunted Mansion at Walt Disney World. They were the ones who, the cast members there were the ones who came up with the whole concept that Gracie was the master of the mansion, which has now become part of
like
the
legend
Disney,
and lore,
official approved narrative. But that was not the case, and they were basing that on the fact that they saw a tombstone out there that was for Master Gracie. Okay? Well, I talked to Ex Atencio, who's an Imagineer, and he's the one who created those tombstones, and he did those as gags for some of the people he worked with. And Yale Gracie was a terrific Imagineer. He's the one who came up with the Pepper's Ghost concept, for in the dancing ballroom there. But he came up with that concept from a book that he had as a kid. It was called The Boy Magician. And The Boy Magician was literally a book filled with elaborate magic tricks that a young boy could learn to do. And Pepper's Ghost was one of those, where you could create, sort of a fake ghost for your haunted house or for your magic show. And Yale just had that boyish enthusiasm. And so X's name is actually Xavier, but he likes being called Ex Atencio. He's still around, thank heavens. He said, I called it Master Gracie because in the time period of the mansion, Master was the title that you gave to a young boy who was not old enough to be called Mr. So you had Master Lord Fauntleroy or whatever, and he said, so I was doing that, to tease him and tweak him a bit. He says, it was never my intention that, Gracie was supposed to be in fact, his intention was something completely different. The same thing with the hitchhiking ghosts. I talked with Mark Davis, who did the designs for those, and he said, I never had any intention to give them any names other than, they're the hitchhiking ghosts. That's what they were.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, well, these are the names that people are calling them. And he says, I don't know where those names came from. And he said, if I had to come up with names, I would come up with different names. But now, because they're out there, and again, the longer they're out there, it becomes, well, that's the fact. I see in Jason Sorrell's book about the Haunted Mansion that he lists the names of the hitchhiking ghosts. And it's like, Jason, these don't exist in any documentation anywhere other than, just public, but now it's, well, one of my favorite movies is a John Ford Western called The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance.
I know where you're going with this.
Yeah, and one of the premises of the movie is that a legend can become so appealing and engaging that it becomes the truth. Mm-hmm. Despite all of the contradictions, all of the other things that you can bring out to show, no, this isn't the case, people still want to believe that legend.
When legend becomes fact, print the legend.
There you go. That's the exact quote there. That's the exact quote that the newspaper editor says at the end of the film there. And I think, unfortunately, a lot of that has happened with Disney history. And in fact, a lot of the people who know the real stories are no longer with us. Or if they are with us, some of the people who knew Walt Disney and all are pretty much up there in age right now. Mm-hmm. And sometimes their memories will get confused, or they only saw part of the project. Walt would oftentimes have several different people working on something at the same time without them realizing it. And so, a lot of this stuff is getting lost. And so one of the things that I feel a great responsibility for, as I'm heading into the autumn of my years here, is I better get this stuff out while I still know some of it, and I can still support some of this stuff with documentation, because a lot of this stuff will disappear. Once I worked at the Disney Institute as an animation instructor, and I will tell you, when the Disney Institute closed down as a physical location, which is where Saratoga Springs is today, but mm-hmm. there was a physical location for Disney Institute. When that closed down, there was stuff that was just tossed into the dumpsters. Original concept art of what the Institute was supposed to be, names, things like this. And again, as a cast member, you were told you cannot go into the dumpsters because that is proprietary Disney information. So you cannot rescue that. Although one of the most frightening things that happened is about 3 months after Disney Institute closed down, somebody phoned me and said, you better check on eBay. And I went on eBay, and there's an autographed picture of me being sold on eBay. and I'm going, that's my picture, that's my autograph, that's what the heck is it? And so I contacted the seller, and it had been hanging in the lobby of the Performing Arts Center, the Performance Center there at the Disney Institute, when they had people like John Canemaker and Michael Graves and all this. They'd always take their picture, and then they'd ask them to sign it, and then they had, them along the walls. And I did several presentations there, and I said, no, don't put me up there with these other guys and all this. No, we have to do. And so apparently those had all been tossed out, and this guy had recovered some from the dumpster.
Out of curiosity, how much were they asking for it?
Actually, they were asking $50. And I told them, look, if there's somebody stupid enough to buy that for $50, let me know, and I will send them a free autographed copy of one of my books. And they did sell it, and for more than $50. And I'm embarrassed about it to this day. But again, as I said, Imagineering got rid of a lot of its documentation because it's like, well, we're not building Mount Fuji in the Japan pavilion, so why do we need all of these concept sketches and, all of this? And it's costing us money to store it. It's costing us money to catalog it and insure it and all of this. So let's just get rid of it.
Oh, boy.
And I know. But again, there's just too much stuff. I talked with Dave Smith about it, and he says, people don't realize that we don't really spend our time, just sitting around doing research. So much stuff is coming in every single day.
And there's only so much that the archives can hold.
Yeah, it's coming in from also from now the franchises. Star Wars and Muppets and Marvel and all that. All of that has to be cataloged. All of that has to be scanned. All of that has to be then stored. So, of course, the archives has storage off property, which is much more extensive than their actual physical location. But even then, sometimes they don't know what they. Dave was great. Dave Smith is a good friend. I've known him for quite some time. And in the beginning, it was just him. It was a department of one person, and there was a very small budget. So sometimes they'd get one of those storage boxes, and Dave would write on the side, Disney in World War II, and so he would put in the material, for Disney in World War II. If there was any room left in the box, he would pack in other stuff just to fill up the box to the top. But then he wouldn't write along the side of the box what else was in there.
Oh, no.
Which is why the Disney Archives is continuing to find stuff.
There are these hidden treasures.
Yes. Yeah. Well, in fact, I was sitting there in the office at the archives with Dave one day when he was flipping through some stuff, and he opened up a folder, and out slipped this comic book. And it's a very rare comic book. It was a giveaway comic book called Donald Duck and the Atom Bomb. And at the time, in the Overstreet Comics price guide, it was worth about $1,500.
Wow.
And the archives didn't have a budget to really go out and buy things. And if it did, that certainly wouldn't have been, in the top 10 or top 100 or maybe even top 1,000. And here it was in mint condition. It had been just slipped in between two average other comic books, and it just slipped out by accident. And now they have this valuable collector's item in mint condition.
That's amazing.
Isn't it amazing? And so that's why it's very important to get this stuff down into places where people can find it. In fact, that's one of the reasons I wrote that book, The Book of Mouse, because I'm a huge Mickey Mouse fan, especially the Mickey Mouse of Walt Disney. But I have literally dozens of books that have Mickey Mouse information in them and magazines and things like this. I wanted them all in one location. and in the process of doing that, I ran across material that nobody else had. But now there's a book out there, so anybody who wants to know all about Mickey Mouse in the parks or, in the animated films or whatever, there it is. And by the way, these books are all available through themeparkpress.com or Amazon.com.
If you go on Amazon and search for Jim Korkis, you'll find a nice list of books there.
Yes.
We'll hear more from Jim next week in part 2 of our conversation. He'll be talking about his other new book, The Vault of Walt, Volume 4.
I've always considered myself extremely fortunate for the opportunity to run the company that Walt Disney founded just over 90 years ago. And today is another reminder of who he was, what his interests were, his talent, his vision, much emanating from this very place. And just looking around his office reminds you of his devotion to his family, his curiosity, his relentless creative passion. And thanks to our archives team, Walts Office has been restored right down to the tiniest detail, a painstaking process to put everything back exactly the way it was the last time Walt used his office in 1966.
And with those words, Bob Iger introduced the newly restored offices of Walt Disney. The project was undertaken as part of the celebration marking the studio's 75th anniversary at its Burbank location. The offices will remain on permanent display, open to Disney employees, cast members, and studio visitors. It will also be added to the studio tours D23 hosts periodically for its gold level members. On hand for the unveiling were 3 of Walt's granddaughters, Joanna Miller, Jennifer Goff, and Michelle Lund. Joanna had this to say about Granddad's office.
I think one thing that you take from this is it's a humble place. The design of the furniture is modern and was modern at the time when he built the studio, but it's not a big office. It's a very cozy, humble place with things that he loved in it and things that we remember from our childhood.
Disney songwriting legend Richard Sherman, along with his brother Robert, spent plenty of time in Walt's office back in the day, pitching and performing songs. To see the office again after all these years was a very personal thing for Richard.
It's very overwhelming. It's very emotional. I feel very thrilled that they love it, put enough love in that to make it really the way it was. It truly is exactly the way it was then. And I must say, it's a very emotional, very thrilling thing. And it's wonderful that the world can now come and visit this place and see what this great man did. He was humble. He didn't have a fancy office. It was just a simple little office with his kids on the walls and nothing, no big to do. And that's where he was. He was a very simple, wonderful, complicated genius, but still he's a simple soul in a way.
And finally, Dave Smith, who founded the Walt Disney Archives 45 years ago, shares with us the first time he ever met Walt Disney.
I fondly remember as meeting Walt Disney once when I was a teenager, visiting Disneyland, and I saw him walking through the park. And of course I knew what he looked like because he introduced his television show in those days. And so I went up to him and asked for his autograph, and he politely declined. He said when he started signing autographs, he got this huge crowd around him and he never got his work done. So he told me to write him at the studio and he'd send me his autograph, and I did, and he did, and I still have it today.
And that will do it for this edition of the Mouse Castle Lounge. Be sure to drop by next week when Jim Korkis once again is my guest. Stay up to date with everything going on in the Mouse Castle Lounge. Subscribe to us on iTunes, Stitcher, or SoundCloud. You can also download the free Mouse Castle Lounge app, which you can get right now by going to themousecastle.com and clicking Get the App. Anthony Reynolds and I host Inside the Mouse Castle with your weekly dose of Disney news, information, and commentary. We'll be back again on Monday night, so please join us then. The Mouse Castle Lounge is not affiliated with the Walt Disney Company. I just like to talk about them. I'm Tim Calloway. It's been a blast as always, so let's do this again real soon. Take care.